Hey there. Good morning. Good morning. So I had after last night's little riff. I had a message that came in. Just a simple question: what do I do if I hate my boss? Right? And man, I can appreciate that. I also found it really odd as I was scrolling through the little emoji things to stick on here that it said human. Right? Like the emoji that I chose was human, and there's another thought process there, right? Of like, what does it mean to feel human? And the fact that I have to consider that and really um, think about qualities around that is a whole nother conversation, I think, for another day. But I thought that was funny. So I digress. Um, so I hate my boss, right? I hate my boss, and what do I do about that, right? So as I said yesterday, that's the largest reason, the biggest reason. Good morning, Robert. That's the biggest reason why people quit, right? It's why they quit their jobs. It's why they change jobs. But that in and of itself kind of creates this dynamic of, and I think for there's a lot of us here that are that are probably in relationships, and if you're not now, you probably have been, whether it's a boyfriend or a girlfriend or whether you're married, is like relationships are hard, right? But one of the fundamental things is knowing, are you running away from something, right? Or are you running towards something, right? And so when we think about that from a leadership perspective of that, again, being the primary reason why people leave the positions that they're in, um, it is that next level management, or just the level above that. And I think that mentally, as we think about that, as we're dealing with the emotional toll of being led by somebody who might be ill equipped, right? But I think that, and I was reading through the message a little bit, and let me tee this up because I think that the way that it was stated is really important. Is that as soon as we start saying they're good or they're bad, we forget about how much gray area is present, right? That as soon as I say that somebody is a bad leader, then I've kind of written this prescription, and all hope is lost, right? When probably maybe I would challenge or maybe tee up a better way to think about that. There's a ton of gray area between good or bad, and I don't think that you know there are definitely bad people in the world. Absolutely, 100%. Absolutely. But I think for the most part, it's not about being a good or a bad leader. It's probably more about being an equipped or ill-equipped leader, right? And there's a lot to unpack there. So again, this may not be the best medium to do that, but at a high level, we'll just say, hey, if you just considered that they're ill-equipped, then what does that do for you, right? What does that do for your emotional state and the mentality that you bring to the table in that team, right? For yourself, for that leader, and for your team, right? Because teams are a community effort, right? They're little micro communities inside of all of these other communities, right? I just love Venn diagrams. I think mostly because the kid in me is just like, just give me some crayons and a piece of paper and a juice box, and I'm good for an hour, right? But it's funny because when we think about good or bad, we step into that place, and probably we don't have the full picture, right? We don't know what their story is. We don't know what their origin story. We don't know what they've been through. We don't know what type of trauma triggers they have, why the responses are what they are. We just assume that it's intentional, right? And most of the times, I genuinely, in the leaders that I've been around, people that are in leadership roles, generally speaking, it's an ill-equipped, right, not ill-intended. And so that's a fundamental thing, I think, that opens up space for us to consider and really appreciate our differences, but be more curious about our commonalities, right, as well, because in a place where we are curious about our commonalities, right? Then it, like any salespeople that are, I've got a ton of sales folks, because there's a lot of sales folks, again, technically and transactionally, that ascend very well. They do extremely well financially, but there's a massive blind side when it comes to, okay, now how do I duplicate and replicate that in the workplace so that one, you can continue to ascend there, but also provide an opportunity for others. But leading teams of high performance producers is really difficult, right? And so again, that's a perfect example of an ill-equipped leader. And so if you're a salesperson here and you think about this, like sales 101 is looking for common ground, right? Like how do you open it? I mean, I remember at really early stages in my career, and I've done a lot of things, right? But I can remember as a small stint, like 4 months where I sold cars, right? And really it's just my curiosity. Like I just insatiably be curious about different aspects of business. But one of the fundamental things I remember, Art, which is a guy who had been there, I think he was selling cars for 125 years before he worked with me a little bit. But he's like, hey, when you walk past the car, just take a peek inside. Try to find something that you can latch onto for common interest. And I think that when we enter a conversation looking for commonalities, it opens the door, right? It opens the door for us to have conversations. But probably the biggest thing that we can do as individuals, right, is one, don't abdicate that responsibility for them to know, right? Don't abdicate that responsibility and set that expectation that they are equipped just because they're in a particular role, right? That the biggest thing that we can do is take a look at and see, again, I talked about this before, but it's so important that ownership, right? That our personal ownership over us, ourselves, right? Our skill sets, our mindsets, our traits, and how is that impacting how we show up? But here's why that's important, right? That is, if I am emotionally unstable, right, then any type of feedback, any type of criticism, anything that's not exactly how I had it played out in my head, I might receive in a defensive posture. Well, what happens from there, right? Hell, it just comes unraveled from there, right? So having ourselves in a emotionally stable place, and there's a lot of work it takes to get there, right? It's not a hey, let me take this 3-hour course and we can check that box. But uh, understanding our own mindsets, traits, and skill sets as it relates to, well, one, for ourselves, and then as we take those things into the workplace and into the environment, right? So there's all of that, right? There's all of that as we think through that, and we have a lot of leaders that just generationally are ill-equipped. They are from a generation standpoint. There's nothing good or bad about this. So remember how we started, right? Like unpack, untangle, decouple, untie that knot of belief from good and bad, right? And just stay in the place of how do I better understand how we got here, right? And there's a ton of leaders that are in leadership roles that just learn differently. They came from a very transactional environment, right? That again, if you think about the industrial age, it was extremely transactional, right? Even those that have served and then come into this, but how is a person conditioned, right? What have they, again, if we think about the origin story, where somebody comes from, what they bring into this place, if they have been conditioned to operate and function and been rewarded for a transactional approach to business, then guess how they're going to lead, right? Like, why would they lead any differently? That's how they've been rewarded, right? Like that's what's been conditioned into them. So they show up and say, hey, we're going to have this transactional approach, and I'm going to give orders, and you're going to take orders, and well, that's good enough because that we need the safety of this organization. Those days are gone, right? And so we're kind of challenging this old norm of leadership, right? As we show up and say, hey, things are really important. Like how I feel at work, culture, right, is really important. And we've been beating that drum. There's tons of authors. I mean, I don't know, there's probably 20 books up here about culture, right? About just different facets of culture. And so we have to consider and keep space for how we got here. Today's economy requires agility, right? When you think about the speed of business today, we have to build leaders and people who can keep up with today's economy at scale, right? And a large aspect of that is the ability to move fast together, right? Another buzzword, and again, I hate buzzwords, but it is in essence team agility, right? And our ability to move fast and move fast together. And in order to do so, we've got to be we have to be equipped and prepared in an emotional state to do that, right? If I'm defensive about a decision, then man, we just bottleneck, right? Like my mentality, my mindset, the traits that I have have just caused a bottleneck for the team, right? And I'll tell you, I speak to individuals a lot that aren't in leadership roles, but they are aspiring leaders. I mean, they have a heart to take on more responsibility, right? To just shoulder that backpack and that weight vest of more. Like they recognize the gaps and they want to step into those, and it's with a good heart. Like if you got a crappy, I'm not interested, right? If you're driven by accomplishment, and you're driven like it's just not the right time, right? For those of you that are in leadership roles, I know that it doesn't make sense, right? I know that it is hard. Like it just transactionally doesn't add up sometimes in what's required from you emotionally, time wise, the effort that you put in, the unseen projects, right? The things that are in your head that you just can't get out, the sleepless nights, um, the conversations that you take home with you, like all of those things that you're battling with when you step into a place of being responsible for a team of people, right? I had a great mentor, love this guy to death, and he framed up, um, really leadership is having people under your care and protection. And I don't mean that from a hierarchical standpoint. And I don't mean that from a protector standpoint. Like none of those posturing states, but it is shouldering the responsibility of caring for and protecting other individuals and other individuals and their families as well, right? Like there is a lot of weight in that, right? And it doesn't make sense. And I know it's a lot to shoulder, but it's absolutely a long-term game, right? I know a lot of teachers that talk about looking back, and one of the most fulfilling things is considering the impact that they made at an individual level and how that has transcended into family. Like literally a great teacher. We hear those stories about great teachers who completely change the perspective, the trajectory of a family tree, right? The same is true for great people who aspire to be great leaders, that this is a long term game, right? That, you know, your impact, and it's just, it can have a generational effect. And I know that it's a lot to take on. So, just know that it's not unseen. There are plenty of us. There are plenty of people that see you, that hear you, that feel you, that you're not alone in that. Continue to shoulder the responsibility of that and stay in the heat because the long term game is worth fighting for. People are worth fighting for. Better teams are worth fighting for. Better organizations are worth fighting for. And every single person that you can make an impact, you make an impact in their family too, not just financially, right? But when you develop a person, not just train a person, when you develop a person, they get to take their whole self back home. They get to bring their whole self back into the workplace. And man, that hit from another mentor's mouth, that has the opportunity to make a dent in the universe. Have a good Thursday.